Well, thank you, everyone. It is certainly a conversation we're going to have on a topic that does have worldwide consequence, and I'm very glad to be here with my friend, the former Secretary of Agriculture. So I want to dive right in. We're going to have questions at the end for, I think, about 10 minutes. Dan, Secretary Glickman, we were just talking about how the World Food Program has said that we are facing the world's largest food crisis in modern history. We have seen since the start of the war in Ukraine, 70 million people that, as a result of soaring food and fertilizer and fuel costs, have been brought to the brink of starvation. We've seen another 345 million impacted in terms of the world food supply chain. It's clear that Russia is using food as a weapon. What are the implications to not just that region, but to the world as a result?
Well, first of all, thanks, Lisi, and for all of you for being here. You can applaud as much as you want. It's, or boo or hiss or whatever. All these great ironies with respect to the food situation. Number one is, I just made the point to Lisi before, historically, food has never been at the top of the global geopolitical agenda. When I was secretary, I'd go to conferences with world leaders, and they might put the food and agriculture people in the ante-room behind the bathroom. And in the main room was nuclear security and mostly armed services related issues. And now we're beginning to realize, this stuff, food security, starvation, hunger, climate, pests and disease, just feeding hungry people, not only around the world, but here in the U.S., is a really big deal. And it impacts global stability everywhere. And now even the private sector and corporations are understanding how important this is to their lives, a predictable, reliable source of food. So it's good that we're discussing this issue, and it's being discussed a lot of places now. And I guarantee you in the COP26 and in the next G8 or G20, food is going to be an integral part of the discussion. Food, agriculture, production issues, hunger, malnutrition, and all the related issues, especially as they deal with climate. To your question, it's an interesting thing. We probably produce enough food in this world. It's just so misallocated that the people who really need it so desperately either can't produce it themselves or subject to issues like embargoes and dislocations of supply chains. So you see South Asia, North Africa are directly affected by Ukraine and by Russia. And even we in the United States and the developed world are impacted by the inflationary pressures that are caused by what they're doing. And it's difficult to figure out how to deal with this issue because we kind of have a madman in Russia who's created this amazing instability that I don't think anybody, Lisi, really ever thought could happen. And so that's tough. It shows you all the systems, all the mitigation, all that adaptation didn't really take into account if you had a character who had geopolitical ambitions that were not rational.
Certainly. Well, one of the implications of his actions has been the forced migration, 6 million from Ukraine, and we see the increasing pressures on refugees now in Asia and Africa. What are they to do other than perish if they don't migrate? Many are migrating north into Europe right at a time where there's security and another issue of energy. As well as inflation and such. What's the impact of that now when we're combining the food crisis with energy crisis and climate issues and such? What does that mean?
Yeah, people will move where they can exist and have jobs and take care of their families. We see that in the United States with the numbers of people trying to get into this country. Actually, the Europeans have done a better job than I think the U.S. has done in terms of accepting migrants and dealing with the issues not only of Ukraine, but also the issues of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where a lot of the migration is occurring because of climate, the floods in Pakistan, for example. And so the future does not look so bright as it relates to stable indigenous populations, because if you continue to have the climate problems that we have, people are going to move in great droves, and that's added to the fact you talk about in terms of political destabilization that we've seen in Ukraine. The best we can hope for in the short term is to end this Ukrainian problem, but it doesn't look very hopeful right now with the Russians bombing the hell out of all the infrastructure. Ukraine may be dark all winter. You're going to see more people leave, go to Germany, go to Poland, and perhaps to the United States as well. So it just shows you how inextricably linked we are together.
Indeed, and if you take a look at another issue within this issue, it's the rising price of the food itself, the interest rates, and countries that depend on food imports from Ghana to Pakistan, they can't afford it. And so this crisis is much larger than I think we know.
And a short term is we just have to make sure we provide enough humanitarian assistance so that people don't starve to death. I mean, people say to me, well, what can we do in the next 6 months? Not much, except make sure that we continue to supply the world with food. The U.S. does a great job. We provide about half the assets, grain and cash, to the World Food Program, the UN, which is the largest humanitarian organization in the world, the World Food Program. It feeds several hundred million people a year. We got to keep doing that, certainly in the short term. In the longer term, what we've got to hope for is our agriculture becomes more resilient so people, smallholder farmers, can make money using modern technologies to grow crops and raise animals in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and in Latin America. Because if we don't, we're probably going to continue to have this kind of crisis over and over again.
2 weeks ago, Foreign Affairs had an article from a crop scientist to go back to what you said before, and you were alluding to now, that we don't have a food supply issue, it's a distribution. And that's what they argued. It's just going to the wrong places. And the conclusion was we've got to address the issue of agribusiness and respond not to the current players within the system, but focus on what the public needs, which is a food supply that provides food to those who are in greatest need of it, regardless of where they are in the world. You were a former Secretary of Agriculture in this country with implications around the world. Do we need to change the structure in order to fix the problem?
I think it was H.L. Mencken who said, for every complicated problem, there is a simple and a wrong solution. And so the only thing about what you just quoted from is it implies there's some magic solution. We can change our food system overnight and then we're going to take care of this problem. And I wish that were the case. It's a complicated issue. For example, in the United States, we feed 340 million people a day. Yeah, it's become more concentrated in recent years, and agribusiness has gotten better, but there are some positive trends on there. Smallholder farmers, organic agriculture, direct marketing, farmers markets, new technologies have helped in that regard. But to feed billions of people a year, you're going to probably need somewhat similar food systems to what we have now. We have to make them more diverse. We have to improve the technologies. But we're not going to magically change that. But what we can do as policymakers is to elevate these issues to a higher level so smart people around the world can talk about them. And that's something that hasn't happened until fairly recently.
We also were talking a few moments ago about the developments in China and what we've seen in recent days with President Xi Jinping, and of course a large amount of the food supply is from that part of the world as well. What do you think the implications are on this very complicated relationship that we have that's fraught with a lot of risk to food and other supply chains around the world?
It's a great question, because I'm sure a lot of people here are affiliated with companies that are doing business in China. And, I'm a little bit of a contrarian. Both political parties in the United States have made China the #1 enemy. And the Chinese are not easy to love either. When you look at human rights, you look at some of their environmental record, you look at the authoritarian regime that have taken place, but we just have to find a way to deal with them. They're almost our equal in terms of the U.S. in terms of their economic power. And when you look at issues like food security, science, health, space, We got to find a way to compartmentalize the issues where we have to deal with them and still recognize that we have an obligation to fight for human rights and intellectual property enforcement and keeping them from trying to expand militarily all over the region. And we've been fairly successful in the countries as kind of doing both. But if we totally isolate China, I don't think it helps the U.S. or helps Europe as well.
Well, so what then do you think some of the solutions are to try to address what we've been talking about thus far in terms of the supply chains and the aspects of disruption that are happening, and not just on food, but across all aspects of the chain?
You know, one thing is positive. The private sector is now much more an active player in issues about how to develop supply chains that work. There had serious problems during the early part of COVID in terms of the ports in Southern California, the Long Beach and Los Angeles port, which are the largest ports in the United States in terms of goods coming in. And the solution to try to, expedite and move the flow of goods faster really was in response to a almost concerted company and private sector efforts to address the problem, to make sure they had the right information. But the government wasn't the only player in the action. So, I think people of goodwill in our government will continue to work on ways to improve supply chains but I do think that companies, the private sector, are going to have a much bigger role than they did in previous in terms of trying to find solutions to the problems. And when you talk about global hunger, now you have almost a dozen major American corporations actively engaging in international development assistance and human capital, and that's a really positive trend. And maybe some of the folks here are with companies that are advising companies to deal with those kinds of issues.
You spoke about government. In 13 days, we have a midterm here in the United States. Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Republican Party in the House, has recently said that they will reevaluate military aid to Ukraine if Republicans take the House. How much does that, in these midterms, implicate what we're talking about now in Ukraine and the world food supply? And do Americans here voting recognize just how consequential their vote may be, regardless of whatever side they have as part of the global world that we live in?
Well, first of all, I can't hide my bias. I was a Democratic congressman for 18 years, so I'm naturally hoping that there are some changes in the Congress that takes place. I've served in Congress where actually we got along with each other much better than we do now. And there was a level of bipartisanship that was not without some rancor, because you'll always have that in a political system, but we tended to work together, particularly on issues like in agriculture, food security, hunger, and develop sustainable solutions to a lot of our problems. Even climate, which was at an incipient stage, was not terribly political back then. So, I don't know what's going to happen in these elections. I suspect we're going to end up with both houses of Congress being very close. It may switch a few seats. The Republicans may take the House. Who knows? I think the Democrats will likely keep the Senate, but I just don't know. It's just too unpredictable. I think the trick is that how we can make common cause to deal with a lot of these problems without just this constant fighting and bickering and dividing America like we see that what's happening right now. And that's where, again, I go back to the private sector, because they've got to step up and engage their governments. If they don't, they got to do it themselves to do the right thing and try to get solutions, to be facilitating solutions to a lot of these problems. And so I wish I had a more magic answer to these issues. But in the meantime, you just got to do the best we can, and hopefully messaging that comes out from people in this industry and others will help people in the private sector and government construct messages that are more positive and constructive and less divisive.
We're going to get to questions here in about 5 minutes. Secretary Glickman, how much of the challenges that we're facing now in the global food supply is a result of what we are doing here in this country? I
think by and large, without being overly parochial, the U.S. does a pretty good job in terms of global food issues. Number one is we have continued to provide on a bipartisan basis. We're the leading humanitarian provider of food assistance in the world. And that number actually went up the last couple of years. That's good news, you know. If you were asking me to what we ought to be doing in the future for these problems, is that we need an adequately funded research budget, both private and public, to deal with issues like water. 70% of the water in the world is used to irrigate crops and feed animals. 30% is for everything else, including the water that you're drinking, industrial use water. And so as we go into a climate situation where drought and related climate issues become worse and worse and worse, you can just see the handwriting on the wall. You can have all sorts of conflicts all around the world about water rights, water utilization. So we need to find ways to address that. And one of the best ways is to figure out, A, how to desalinate water economically, and then how to use brackish water, or water that we basically throw away, clean it up and drink it, or allow it to be used for other positive purposes. So water is a huge issue. And pest resistance, so that we won't have crops that are being wiped out. Ways to help smallholder farmers produce crops much more efficiently, being accessing to new technologies, particularly women and other smallholder farmers. And these are things the U.S. just needs to be much more aggressively involved in. Then the issue of supply chains. We just have to work with our allies, and again, going back to the private sector, to figure out where the gaps are in the system, you know. And, smart minds are trying to think about these things right now. It wasn't that way 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
And what do you think has changed, other than we've got a war that's forced the world to understand what the supply chain is, and now the various aspects of the supply chain, and how much we here in the U.S. and others around the world are connected to this one supply chain?
Yeah, good point. You know, look, I've been involved in food and agriculture for a long time, and I don't think I even realized the impact of Ukraine and Russia on the world food supply. The Ukrainians are responsible for, maybe 15, 18% of the wheat production in the world, about 25, 30% of the sunflower oil production in the world, and most of that goes into vulnerable places like North Africa and South Asia. But so even though they're not as big a factor as we are in the United States, they're a huge factor when you consider the whole agricultural situation and supply chain. And so what the war has done, if there's any silver lining, which there never is in a war, is it's caused us to realize what the impact of all of this is. And it's impacting us here in the United States in terms of bread prices and food prices and meat prices. There are other inflationary pressures, but this is a big one of them, big part of it. So, it was years ago, I met this guy. He was a very intelligent guy, I think it was Michael Beschloss, who's an historian, right, who was talking about issues in government. He says, well, if you want to get that issue resolved, go talk to the Secretary of Agriculture. Like, it's not very important. So I told Beschloss, I said, I thought the Agriculture Department was the most important department in the world, because if people aren't fed, nothing else can happen. And he smiled. He says, spoken like a true agriculture secretary. But I go back to this point, the fact that we're even talking about this here. Right. I'm going to speculate that probably if you look back at the last 30 or 40, 50 years in your industry, this was probably not a subject that people talked about very much. Food access, food availability, nutrition, hunger, and then the food supply chain writ large. And yet, we have a lot of very good companies doing very good work in a lot of these areas. But there are still imperfections in the system. And this whole thing with Ukraine and Russia has really brought it to the forefront that this is important stuff.
What happens if this war continues and we see further destabilization of the economies and the governments, particularly in the regions that you just referred to, and what that means for geopolitics, geocommerce, and others in the world?
It's like when the Russians were under the Soviet system, we always felt there was some predictability there. So the Russians and us had this kind of north-south pole magnet, and we would never really totally distrust each other. But when you're dealing with somebody like Putin, who doesn't seem to be interested in rational solutions to problems, it's complicated. I'm not saying Putin is exactly like Hitler, but there are a lot of parallels there. How do you deal with somebody who doesn't fit the rational way of doing business in the world? So if he continues on, if he bombs the hell out of Ukraine, destroys their infrastructure, destroys their pipelines, their supply routes, what does it mean? I don't know. I think we risk much greater military confrontation with the, he's doing poorly militarily, so he's trying to destroy the infrastructure of Ukraine in the process. But, it just makes it more likely that you'll see an East-West military confrontation or the use of tactical nuclear weapons. But one possibility here is both China and India, which are the two largest countries in the world, have finally basically let Putin know, we don't like what you're doing. It destabilizes us as well. There's no positive for the Chinese about the Russians doing what they're doing in Ukraine. It's inconsistent with the Chinese geopolitical agenda, and also with respect to India's role as a growing economic and political power in that world. So, hopefully that's a counterbalance to the worst case scenario that I'm talking about.
Right.
I will say that to their credit, Biden, the Biden administration, and by and large the bipartisan majority in Congress, and led by Senator McConnell, have created a unity in American foreign policy we haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah, this is an area where bipartisanship is a good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure. Want to open it up to questions from the audience. We have just under 8 minutes to go in our session. Let's start here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was genuinely fascinating. Recently heard from a client that one of their investors, and this is a well-regarded VC, is advising its portfolio companies to suspend investment in the UK market because they're predicting food riots in London in 2023. In your opinion, how likely is that to happen in the UK and in other so-called developed markets?
I'm not an expert in this, so I'm going to give you a kind of an off-the-cuff response. And that is that I think the changes in the UK government are constructive changes. We'll see what happens, whether the new prime minister can, kind of the young, handsome, dynamic new prime minister can use his personality and his brain power to kind of bring the British political system together. But I don't think the United States wants to see the UK in a suffering economic role. So I think you'd see the U.S. do everything it could to buttress that if it came to issue of food shortages, food riots in Britain. I mean, Britain's made its own bed with regard to Brexit. So, I mean, I'm not holding them blameless in all of this stuff, but the UK is still America's closest ally. Maybe you could argue Canada is, but I would say the UK probably is. Israel, I mean, there are a lot of countries in that thing. So I think we will do whatever we can to quote, stabilize the British regime.
I agree. I would just add, since I just got back from London, that I think they face, in reality, a riot of another kind, which is 3 prime ministers in the short amount of time of 2 weeks, 2 months, etc. I was in Parliament when this was all happening, not a cause of it by any chance. But the rioting there is a instability of the government, and whether in the implications to the transatlantic relationship, and of course what Europe and the UK are about to face now in terms of energy and other crises. And so I think the real challenge, the more imminent challenge is, will the current prime minister be there in 2 or 3 months? And if not, and that's a serious question. And if not, then what are the further implications of that, particularly on the U.S. and what we've been talking about today?
One thing that's interesting is that if people want to turn the United States into a parliamentary system, just look at England right now. Not necessarily a good example. On the other hand, we're turning ourselves into a parliamentary system. I mean, the House of Representatives is essentially a parliamentary system, and the parties are here, and it's party votes on everything, and I'm not sure that works out so well after all. But our system has always prided itself on the independence of the individual member of either the Senate or the House has a great role. In a parliamentary system, you don't see that as much, and just I think that we don't want it. We want Britain to survive and healthy and prosperous, and it's so important to American identity. But I don't think we want to turn ourselves into Britain either.
Yeah. Other questions in the back? Thank you.
Hi. Fascinating discussion on the geopolitical disruption and sort of that worldview, but I think we see a lot of statistics about food insecurity in this country. Can you comment on that and what role we should be playing with our clients to tackle those issues?
First of all, it's a very good question. And many companies have gotten into this area from involving themselves in relationships with food banks all over the country to mentoring and relationships with public school systems. And so there's, if you look at what a lot of the good things that are happening, they're actually happening with respect to forward-thinking companies that are looking at ESG issues and looking at relationships with stakeholders. And this is a kind of a soft area that warms the heart of a lot of people who live in, let's say, the geographical area of a company. But a couple things. Number one is our SNAP, or food stamp program, feeds on average, about 40 million people a day. So 1 out of every 7 or 8 people in this country is in this system, SNAP. And by and large, the Congress has been supportive of this. They increased something called the Thrifty Food Plan this last year, which increases the value of the benefits to some degree. And most people aren't on SNAP for very long. It's a real counter-cyclical program. We also have a program called WIC, Women, Infants, Children. It is, so many of you know, it is remarkably successful in focusing on pregnant women and babies, young children. It's estimated that almost half of American babies have been on the WIC program at one point in time in their lives. So those federal feeding programs are very important and very successful. And by the way, the U.S. has the most aggressive feeding programs in the world. Other countries have a social safety network, but nobody has the food programs that we do in America. And that's because they've enjoyed bipartisan support over the years. And they've also built a coalition between farmers and urban people. Because farmers, we have this thing called the Farm Bill. It's every 5 years or so. And by and large, it's been successful because you've had this coalition between farmers who look for production agriculture programs. They've worked together with a lot of urban people who care about feeding programs. And together, that coalition has been quite successful. It's under some degree of attack. But look, you know, with inflation the way it is, and gas prices and housing prices and energy and food prices, you know, there are more and more vulnerable people in this country who find it very difficult to make it. And that's why you got to keep those programs alive and well-funded and bipartisan. And then, to your point, or to my point, I don't know whose point it is, to make sure that the companies, private sector knows this is a very, excuse the word, fertile area for them to be a part of in terms of their social responsibility efforts.
I would add to what the Secretary has said. Despite all that great success in these programs and a very strong private sector, this country has not done enough. We have too many children in particular that are either malnourished or have hunger. And here we are in the 21st century, in 2023 on the heels. We have enough food to feed our country many times over. Yep. That's a disgrace. So I'll just say it like that. And so what can corporations and companies do? They can join and push the elected members of Congress together with them to find a solution to this. It won't just be a federal government solution or a state government or government at all. There needs to be private sector involvement in how the food is distributed and how it makes its way to those most in need. And until we do that, then we will have this glaring dichotomy of we produce all this food, we have all this wealth, and yet we can't feed the most hungry in our society. That's disgraceful, if I can say that, in this country. But it gives me hope, because there are a lot of companies as well as members on both sides of the aisle who are trying. But it shows you just how difficult this challenge is in the midst of what we've been talking about, of the geopolitical issues that this world is facing.
One low-hanging fruit is in the area of food waste. So we throw away or waste about a third of our food in this country. A lot of it is because our productivity and people don't like eating food that's got a little flaw in it, and all the way, and it's both with respect to restaurants and hotels and institutional servings, as well as home. So this is where the private sector, many companies have gotten involved in food waste. I'll give you one example. So I was the congressman from Wichita, and this is eons ago, but I went to visit the cafeteria of the Boeing company. Had a big plant in Wichita. They made a lot of airplanes there. And so I went in there, and this was in the early 80s. My wife and I had lunch there with the local heads of the Boeing company. And my wife said, "What happens to the food after lunch?" And he said, "Well, we throw it away." And I said, "But it's not infected, is it?" And he's right. Out of that, the Boeing company developed a relationship with a social service agency in Wichita. And every day the trucks came in and picked up the food. They paid for the refrigeration of the trucks, and they fed about 400 to 500 people a day. Maybe still do. I don't know. I've been gone for a long time. So food waste and how companies get involved, that's certainly one sector. We need to find better ways to deal with the food waste issue, because we throw away a lot of fresh produce every day because it doesn't look good, but it's still nutritious. So this is just one example of the kinds of things that shareholders love to see this stuff. I'm just telling you. I don't know how many of you represent public companies, but it's really a positive if you can do it well.
We have time for one last question.
Sorry.
We don't have time.
We have no time, so
Okay,
says
all
Paul. So thank you
Okay.
all very much, and thank you, Secretary.
Okay,
Glickman.
thank you. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
We only got one hand.
Yes.